I call him my son, and I mean that in every sense of the word that matters. If you think this is a story about autism or money or a courtroom, you're half right. But if you think you already know how it ends, I promise you, you don't. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 57 years old, I drink my coffee black, and I have a son named Isaac who, at 16, sold a piece of software he built in our garage for $3.5 million. And his mother, my ex-wife, who had not said his name in 11 years, showed up 4 months later with a briefcase and a lawyer from downtown Nashville. I want to tell you about that. But first I need to tell you about the Tuesday mornings. Isaac was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder just before his 4th birthday. My wife, Renee, I'll call her Renee because that's her name, and I'm done protecting it. Renee sat across from the developmental pediatrician and nodded very calmly at everything the doctor said. She asked 3 questions, all of them the right questions. Wrote down some notes on a yellow legal pad she'd brought from the house. She was organized like that. Always. Even grief, she organized. She lasted 8 more months. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it's the truth, and this whole thing, everything that happened in that conference room on the 14th floor of a building on Commerce Street, it all comes back to the truth and who bothered to live inside of it. Isaac was 4 years and 3 months old when Renee packed 2 suitcases, left them in the front hallway, and told me she couldn't do it. She said she loved him. She said she loved him. She said she loved me. She said the word capacity 4 times in 10 minutes, which is a very clean word for a very messy feeling. Then she carried those suitcases to her sister's car, and that was the last morning Isaac ever asked me where Mommy was. He asked twice. The first time I told him she had to go away for a while. The second time, maybe 2 weeks later, he didn't look up from his blocks. He just said it quietly, almost to himself, like he was checking whether the answer had changed. It hadn't. He went back to the blocks. I don't know which of us that hurt more, me watching him accept it, or him deciding it was acceptable. For the first year, I was a disaster. I won't dress it up. I was working in IT project management at the time, mid-level, decent salary, nothing spectacular. My mother drove up from Chattanooga every other week to help with Isaac while I tried to figure out what single parenthood looked like when your child has needs that the parenting books don't quite cover. We burned through 2 behavioral therapists before we found Sandra. Sandra was 61, worked out of a small office in Brentwood, and had this way of sitting very still while Isaac talked that he responded to immediately. She once told me that a lot of kids on the spectrum don't need you to fix the silence. They just need you to not be afraid of it. I wrote that down. I kept it on a note card on the refrigerator for years. Isaac was different in ways that are hard to explain quickly. He didn't process sarcasm. Not until he was about 12, and even then it was something he had to consciously decode, like translating from another language. He didn't like loud restaurants or the particular hum of fluorescent lights in big box stores. He had rules about his food touching on the plate that I stopped fighting around year 2, and just accepted as operational parameters of our household. But he was funny. That part people don't expect. He had this absolutely bone-dry delivery. He'd say something completely literal that happened to land as a perfect joke, and he'd blink at you when you laughed, like he wasn't sure what had just occurred. He built things. When he was 7, he built a functional alarm system for his bedroom out of a kit we got at Radio Shack and some extra speaker wire I had in the garage. Not because he was scared of anything. Because he wanted to understand how the components worked. That was Isaac. He wanted to understand how things worked. By the time he was 10, he had moved from electronics kits to actual coding. Nothing I taught him. I knew enough to get by professionally, not enough to teach. He found tutorials online, then forums, then communities of other kids and adults who wrote code for the pleasure of it. He had a notebook, spiral-bound, black cover, where he sketched out logic diagrams in pencil before he wrote a single line of actual code, like an architect drawing blueprints before anyone lays a brick. I used to sit at the kitchen table with my coffee while he worked at his desk in the next room, and I'd listen to the sound of the keyboard and think, I don't know exactly what you're building in there, but I know it's real. That's the thing about raising a kid who's different. You learn to trust the signals you can read, even when you can't read all of them. He built the software when he was 15 and 16, a year and a half of work. It was a tool for small businesses, something to do with inventory management and predictive ordering, connecting to point-of-sale systems in ways that apparently existing products did badly. I understood maybe 40% of his explanations. I nodded at the rest. What I understood clearly was that when he showed it to two local business owners we knew through church, one of them called a friend, and that friend called someone in Atlanta, and 3 months later there was a very quiet acquisition that I mostly processed through the fog of complete disbelief. $3.5 million. Isaac was 16. He sat at the closing table in a button-down shirt I'd had to press twice because I kept doing it wrong, and he answered the attorney's questions in that careful, precise way he had, and afterward we drove to the Waffle House on Murfreesboro Road, because that was where he wanted to go. And he ordered the same thing he always ordered, and I sat across from him and did not trust myself to speak for about 4 minutes. He finally looked up and said, "You're doing the thing where you don't talk because you feel something." I said yes. He nodded. "Me too," he said, and went back to his eggs. We didn't change much. That was a choice I made consciously, and Isaac agreed with it in his way, which meant he didn't disagree, and Isaac was not someone who stayed quiet when he disagreed. We stayed in the same house. I kept working, though I moved to a consulting role that gave me more flexibility. We put the money into a trust, set up properly with a financial advisor named someone or other in Green Hills who specialized in exactly this kind of situation. For 4 months, life was just life. Then I got the call. It was a Thursday afternoon. I was on the back porch with my coffee. I drink a lot of coffee, this is just true, when my phone showed a number I didn't recognize. Nashville area code. I answered it out of habit. The man on the other end introduced himself as an attorney. He said he was representing Renee. He said she had become aware of Isaac's recent financial achievement and had significant concerns about his welfare and the management of his assets. I set the phone down on the arm of the porch chair. Not hung up, just set it down. I looked at the backyard for a moment. The oak tree we'd planted the year Isaac started kindergarten was doing well. Better than I expected, honestly. I picked the phone back up. I said, "I'm sorry, who are you representing?" He said her name again. I said, "And what exactly are these concerns?" He was practiced at this, smooth without being slick. He talked about parental rights that had never been formally terminated, about Isaac's classification as a minor, about fiduciary responsibility. He used the phrase best interests of the child twice in 90 seconds. By the end of the call, I understood that Renee intended to petition for legal oversight of Isaac's trust, and that she had a theory about how she could make that happen. I sat on that porch for a long time after I hung up. I want to tell you what I felt, because I think it matters. It wasn't rage. I know people expect rage in these stories, and I understand why. But what I actually felt was something quieter and more specific than rage. I felt tired. The way you feel tired when something requires you to explain a truth so obvious you shouldn't have to explain it, but you understand that the explaining is now the whole job. I called my own attorney, a woman I'd worked with years earlier on the divorce, who had kept in my contacts for no reason I could have articulated at the time. She listened. She asked good questions. She said this is going to depend a lot on how Isaac presents. I said, define presents. She said, how he comes across, whether they can argue he's not capable of. I said, I understand, and I'm telling you right now that Isaac is the most capable person in any room he walks into. The question is whether anyone in that room figures that out. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, okay, let's start building this. I didn't tell Isaac immediately. I went back and forth on that. He was still 16, technically a minor for 2 more months, and part of me wanted to shield him from the fact that the woman who had left when he was 4 was now attempting to get her hands on his money through a legal maneuver that dressed itself up as concern. But Isaac had always known when something was wrong. Not always the specifics, but the presence of a problem. He'd look up from whatever he was doing and say calmly, something happened. He said that on a Friday evening, 3 days after the phone call, when I was clearly not quite present at the dinner table. I put my fork down. I told him, not all of it, but enough, that his biological mother had contacted a lawyer, that she was trying to claim some authority over his finances, that we were going to handle it. He was quiet for about 30 seconds, longer than usual for him. Then he said, she doesn't know anything about my finances. I said, no. He said, or me. I said, or me. I said, no. He picked his fork back up. Then why does she think she can have an opinion about them? I didn't have a good answer. Some things don't have good answers. They just have facts. The petition was filed in county probate court. Renee's attorney had done his homework, or someone had done it for him. The argument was structured around Isaac's autism diagnosis as a vector for claiming he required guardianship or conservatorship, that a minor with a developmental condition who had suddenly come into significant money was inherently vulnerable and required court-supervised oversight. They had a psychiatric evaluation they'd commissioned through their own expert. They had documentation of the diagnosis. They had, I noticed, nothing that actually described Isaac. Nothing that came from knowing him, watching him, sitting across from him at a Waffle House while he said, "Me too," and went back to his eggs. My attorney called it a clean filing. Legally coherent on its surface. A story that worked if no one looked too hard at the person at the center of it. I spent 6 weeks looking very hard at everything. I gathered Isaac's academic records, his programming certifications, the correspondence from the acquiring company's attorneys, professional, precise, exactly what you'd expect from a 16-year-old who had built something genuinely valuable. I gathered Sandra's clinical notes from over a decade of work. I gathered character statements from his teachers, from 2 of his programming mentors, from the pastor at our church who'd watched Isaac run the soundboard for 3 years with the quiet, meticulous competence that made everyone forget he was a teenager. And then Isaac asked if he could do something. We were in the kitchen. Sunday morning. He had his notebook, the black spiral-bound one, open on the counter, and he was writing something I couldn't quite read from where I was standing. He said, "I want to present something at the hearing." I said, "What kind of something?" He said, "A demonstration." I looked at him for a moment. He was looking at the notebook, pencil moving steadily. I said, "Isaac, you understand this is a legal proceeding. It's not." "I know what it is," he said. Not sharp. Just clear. "I built a product that 11 people with law degrees evaluated and found legally and financially sound enough to acquire for $3.5 million. I think I understand legal proceedings reasonably well." I stood there. He finally looked up. "Will you ask her if I can present something?" I called my attorney that afternoon. She was skeptical. She was also smart enough to ask what the demonstration involved. I told her I wasn't entirely sure, but that Isaac had been working on it for 3 days and had the look he got when something was coming together. She'd met Isaac twice at that point. She said she'd think about it. She called back the next morning and said, "Tell him he has 10 minutes. The hearing was held in a conference room rather than a courtroom. These things often are at the probate level. Renee was there. I had not seen her in 11 years, and I want to say she looked different, but honestly, I wouldn't have known how to evaluate that. She sat beside her attorney and did not look at me. She looked at the table, or at the mediator, or at the window. Not at Isaac, which I noticed. Not once, in the first 30 minutes, did she look directly at her son. Isaac sat beside my attorney in a button-down shirt. The same one from the closing, freshly pressed "I'd done it right this time." With a laptop and a small presentation display he'd asked to bring. He had a printed summary, 3 pages, which he'd formatted himself, and which my attorney had reviewed the night before and described to me as exceptionally clear. Renee's attorney went first. He was good. He laid out the argument with genuine skill, the diagnosis, the money, the minor status, the alleged vulnerability. He talked about Isaac in the third person the entire time. He never asked Isaac a question. He spoke about him the way you speak about a phenomenon rather than a person, and it landed exactly the way I imagine he intended it to. Then Isaac was given his 10 minutes. He stood up, he preferred standing, always had, when he was explaining something, and he connected his laptop to the display. He pulled up a single slide. Just a number, 11 months. He said, "That's how long it took me to build the initial version of the software that was acquired in January. I want to walk you through what that involved because I think it's relevant to the question of whether I understand the assets in question." He was calm. Not performed calm. Actual calm. The kind that comes from being very sure of what you know. He walked through the technical architecture of the software in terms that were precise without being inaccessible. He showed the communication records with the acquiring company. Professional, substantive, no different from what you'd find in any adult-to-adult business correspondence. He showed the timeline of the development. He showed a summary of his financial arrangement with the trust, which he had co-designed with the financial advisor, in which he could explain, term by term, with complete accuracy. He then pulled up a second slide. This one had a chart. Clean, simple, showing the projected growth model of the trust under the current management structure versus 3 alternative scenarios. one of which, he noted without commentary, reflected the fee structure of the guardianship model Renee's petition would impose. The mediator leaned forward. Isaac said, "I've lived with this diagnosis my whole life. I was 4 years old when I was told I had it. I'm 17 now. In that time, I have learned to build things, maintain client relationships, manage a development timeline, and negotiate a legal acquisition. I have a trust managed by a licensed fiduciary. I have an attorney. I have a father who has been present at every single appointment, meeting, performance, and difficult conversation for 13 years. He paused. Just briefly. I do not have a mother who was present for any of them, and I'm not sure what expertise that absence is supposed to have generated. The room was quiet. Renee's attorney started to object about relevance, and the mediator raised a hand. Isaac said, I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for a finding of competence. Those are different things. He picked up the printed summary from the table and set a copy in front of the mediator. That's the technical and financial record. You can evaluate it without my feelings about it. But I did want to be clear about what the record actually contains. He sat down. My attorney did not move. I think she was afraid to break whatever had just happened in the air of that room. Renee's attorney made his counter-arguments. He cited the diagnosis twice more. He questioned whether a 17-year-old could truly understand long-term fiduciary implications. He suggested that the very confidence Isaac had displayed might itself be evidence of a lack of appreciation for risk. Isaac didn't react to any of it. He looked at his notebook, pencil in hand, and wrote something I couldn't see. The mediator asked Isaac one question. She said, Is there anything you'd like to say in response to the claim that your condition limits your capacity for financial decision-making? Isaac looked up from the notebook. He thought for a moment. That careful, deliberate pause that I'd watched him use his whole life before he said something he meant. He said, My condition means I process certain things differently. It doesn't mean I process them incorrectly. The people who built the framework for my trust, who evaluated my software, who worked with me for 11 months on the acquisition, none of them knew I was autistic, until after they'd already decided I knew what I was doing. I think that's the relevant data point. The mediator wrote something down. Renee's petition was denied. The finding noted that Isaac had demonstrated substantial evidence of financial literacy, technical competence, and the capacity to manage his interests with the support of qualified professionals. The existing trust structure was affirmed. The court found no basis for the imposition of external oversight. Renee left the conference room before anyone else. Her attorney shook hands with mine in the doorway, professional about it. I'll give him that. I stood in the hallway with Isaac while people filed out around us. He had his laptop bag over one shoulder and the notebook under his arm. I said, How are you? He thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, the way he always did when people asked questions that other people answered automatically. He said, Okay, I think I'm okay. I said, You were remarkable in there. He gave me that look, the one he'd been giving me since he was small, when I said something that landed differently than I intended. Slight tilt of the head. Processing. He said, I was accurate. That's different from remarkable. We drove home. The oak tree in the backyard caught the late afternoon light when we pulled into the driveway the way it does in October in Tennessee, everything going gold and amber at the edges. Isaac went inside. I stood in the driveway for a minute. There's a porch step on the side of the house where I put my coffee mug every morning when I go back inside. Just set it on the step, handle facing out, while I check the yard, look at the tree, take a breath before the day starts. It's a habit I didn't know I had until Isaac, when he was about 9, pointed at it one morning and said, You always do that. Put the cup there. Every day. I said I didn't realize. He said, I noticed things. I went back inside. I went in after him. He was already at his desk, notebook open, pencil moving, building something new. Some other thing I wouldn't fully understand until it was already finished and real. I made coffee. I put the mug on the step, handle out, the way I always do. And I thought, yeah, we're okay. I've thought about cause and effect a lot since that afternoon in the conference room. Not in any grand philosophical way, just the plain, unglamorous version of it. The idea that what you do every single day accumulates into something. that showing up or not showing up leaves a record, not a record anyone writes down necessarily, just a record that exists in the person you were either there for or weren't. Renee made a choice when Isaac was 4 years old. I don't think she made it lightly. I've had 11 years to stop being angry about it and start seeing it for what it was, a person who hit the edge of what she could carry and put it down. That happens. People do that. But the choice didn't stop having consequences just because she stopped thinking about it. Every appointment I took Isaac to alone. Every evening I sat outside his room listening to him work through something he couldn't articulate yet. Every morning I pressed his shirt wrong and had to do it again. That was the record building. And I wasn't building it to prove something. I was building it because he was my son, and that was the job. What I didn't fully understand until that hearing was that Isaac had been building his own record at the same time. In that notebook. In those 11 months of code. In the way he learned to translate his own mind into language other people could follow. Not because it came naturally, but because he worked at it. Deliberately, methodically, the way he worked at everything. He didn't walk into that conference room with charm or with anger. He walked in with evidence. And the evidence was his life. That's the thing about integrity, not the word. The actual practice of it. It means you do the work when no one's watching, and you let the work speak when it has to. Isaac never expected to need those 11 months of documentation in a courtroom. He kept the notebook because the notebook helped him think. He kept the correspondence professional because that's who he is. He built the trust structure carefully because he wanted it to be correct. None of it was strategic. All of it was character. And when the moment came that required character, he had it. Because he hadn't been saving it up for emergencies. He'd been living it the whole time. I think about what I actually taught him, and I'm honestly not sure I taught him most of what matters. Sandra taught him patience. Hers for him modeled something. His programming communities taught him that competence is a language anyone can learn to read. I think I taught him that you don't have to perform being okay. You can just be okay, quietly, and let that be enough. He taught me the rest. He taught me that different isn't less, that precision isn't coldness, that a kid who processes the world differently can still read a room better than anyone in it when the stakes are real. Renee left because she didn't believe the life we were walking into was survivable. I understand that now without bitterness. What she missed, what she couldn't have known she was missing, was that it wasn't just survivable. It became the best thing that ever happened to me. Not the money, not the hearing. The Tuesday mornings. The sound of the keyboard. The coffee mug on the step. You don't get to outsource the hard years and then collect on the good ones. Not because the universe punishes you, just because it doesn't work that way. The good years are made of the hard ones. You can't separate them. Isaac is okay. I'm okay. The oak tree is doing well. That's the whole story.